So, Denis and Ray Noble, to you, I want to ask that to what extent do you agree with Popper, particularly what I just read out? Because the question that I have is that even though you kind of talk about life as problem solving, but what about the emphasis that he places as problem solving being an evolutionary process, which we also see talked about in memetics, like Richard Dawkins, when he coined the term meme, he's also talking about variation selection there. Do you think that the growth of human knowledge could be understood in terms of that? And I would just like to, in general, see what, tell us a little bit more about what it means for life that even like life forms that don't even have brains like ours, or some of the, or like single cell organism, to be problem solving. What does it mean? Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, one of the fundamental problems that all organisms face is that all around them is a continuous change. That is true even if we just considered the association or interaction between organisms within their ecosystem. It's in a continuous flux, if you like, and therefore an organism is presented with the fundamental problem. Every organism, no matter what level it is at, because by definition of being an organism, it seeks to maintain its existence. It is a process of maintaining its existence over a period of time, at any rate. And in the course of that process of maintaining its existence, it encounters the problem of change. And so therefore, the process of continuing to exist is, if you like, at the heart of almost all the problems that one encounters, that organisms encounter. How one deals with that is facultative, and certainly the facultative nature of organisms has evolved. And so the way in which one deals with the problem has changed. But all organisms, we say that all organisms by definition, if you like, by distinction between something which is considered an organism and something which is considered inanimate, in some way or another faces this fundamental problem of dealing with change. And the only way it can really do that is not just moment by moment dealing with it, but also transgenerationally. The generational process, if you like, is a way of dealing with change. This is one of our fundamental disagreements, incidentally, to some extent, with Richard Dawkins, because Richard Dawkins emphasizes, or the gene-centered view emphasizes that which is immutable. Actually, we don't. We do say that seeking to maintain existence, but that doesn't mean seeking to maintain itself the same. What it's doing is changing in order to maintain existence. And that's a fundamentally different view that to say somebody like Richard has, which is to emphasize the immutable bit. And by emphasizing the immutable bit, he's made the fundamental purpose of organisms to transmit from generation to generation the immutable bit. What we say is the reverse of that, in a sense, which is that actually the process of maintaining one's existence, you seek to change the bit, if you like. I mean, obviously, you don't change everything. It's a bit like in the book, we liken it to trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when the picture itself is changing continuously, and that's how life works. It hasn't got a fixed puzzle that it's solving. It's got a movable puzzle. And in order to solve it, in order to maintain its existence within that puzzle, it has to change.
Just a question on that, because typically Darwinism is taught, we are told that there is a variation and then selection. But at the same time, I've seen Richard Dawkins make the claim that, genes are immortal. How do the two sit together? Because from my understanding, neo-Darwinism does perhaps according to that, it does say that there is variation, and that is what allows new types of adaptations, and where some organisms might become obsolete, others might win, and according to that, there seems to be a bit of a competition going on as well.
What it accepts, neo-Darwinism emphasizes the process of change by small mutation, if you like, by gradual mutation. It's a very, very gradualistic approach, if you like. What
comes to mind is the ship of Theseus.
Sorry, can you?
What comes to mind is the ship of Theseus.
Yes.
Okay, so we will try to limit it that if you did want to have input or questions, just use the bottom button. There's a reactions button and you can raise your hand.
Oh, it's certainly
just
fine.
so
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
Please interrupt and
Sure.
ask. It seems to me that that's the way we do what Popper likes, which is to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also,
If I may,
can
there
you
was also,
yes, is it possible for you to stop sharing screen, Sadia, because many of us can't see easily what is going on unless you stop sharing screen? Yes, that's great. That makes a big difference. Thank you very much.
yes, but may I, in terms of ground rules, so Sadia wanted to use the first hour to kind of get in the meat of it, because there's several moving pieces.
Understood. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
And so whoever wants to ask a question, if you just could wait, because there's 2 more hours that you can do non-stop asking questions and interrupting and whatever you would love to do. But right now to just, let's set up the framework.
Understood.
And what would be great is to put, I'm sorry, and what would be great is to put like any questions in the chat, so just in case you forget later on, we could get into that. I guess my only concern is that, to be able to make it through and then we just open up the chat and there are different topics which are all interconnected, perhaps.
Could I just say, in continuing what you're answering the question, sorry. What is happening?
I think somebody was unmuted. I can't tell.
Oh, I see. I was going to say
Yes.
that one of the fundamental problems I think that the neo-Darwinist position has with the gradual mutation idea is those gradual mutations tend to be just simply absorbed within the population. They don't actually produce, they produce certain change, certainly. But I think that this is something that even goes back to Darwin himself, really, and he would have puzzled over, which is that it's very difficult to find a way of getting species change or speciation out of those small mutations, because those small mutations, if they're successful in the way that Richard Dawkins and others believe they are, or would be, that they just simply become part of the gene pool in the population, if you like. It's a question that we often ask them, how do you get speciation from that if it's just simply absorbed within the population? Darwin himself, although he called his book The Origin of Species, he also puzzled over this question of how you get a distinction between groups of animals, groups of organisms, sorry, such that they sort of hive themselves off and then go off in a completely new direction that creates fundamental change. If you look at the major periods of speciation in history, you find that it's an explosion, really, that occurs of different forms. These are not the gradual mutations. We also give some examples of even recent changes that have occurred. They occur by, in the book, we liken it very much to a child playing with Lego bits. You don't actually just simply start with all the little Lego bricks. You start with functionality. You start, this is what organisms do. you have a degree of things that are already built, as it were, have certain shapes, certain sizes. And what happens in evolution is that these get switched around. Fundamental things, even my being able to hear, apart from the fact that I depend on hearing aids, even your ability to hear comes from a fundamental reorganization of the system of vertebrates in order to create the kind of ear ossicles that operate in your middle ear that are able to transmit the vibration of the sound. And this has not occurred through tiny mutations. It's a fundamental reorganization. I mean, this is seen, you see it in many, perhaps Denis will give us some examples. I'll hand it over because I'm talking far too much. And Denis, I'm sure, will be able to give a much better rendition of the examples of how we've had these fundamental reorganizations of the genetic material that produces really fundamental change, not just, small mutations.
Just
Could I
briefly,
also add one more question to that as well as you address it? Typically in evolution, it's said that there isn't any type of directionality, in the sense that if I ask somebody that does the evolution necessarily tend towards overall and in a more and more type of functionality emerging. Do you think that there is, I mean, clearly when we look at the history of the Earth, the life has just become more and more interesting, more diverse. I mean, and there seems to be a reaction to that type of question as well, because a lot of times I feel like whenever you get into this territory, anytime you ask a question which somehow tends to support in any way, or not support, but is in line with the religious people, then right away, just for that, you just get backlash, and it's assumed that you're going to support creationism.
Yeah.
But for those of us who are really truly interested in asking questions and don't care whether it supports or it goes in line with, we really want to know. And to me, it seems like the functionality overall has increased, even though at short periods of time it doesn't. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Exactly so, Sadia, if I may come in on that. We are witnessing that at this very moment, the generation of what is sometimes called the Anthropocene is clearly directional. We are driving the ecosystem. We do not know for certain where, but my goodness, do we have ideas on what we fear it might do, what we might do in order to prevent it from doing so. Now, what Darwin would have said to this is nearly all organisms do that, and he illustrated that with sexual selection. I would regard that as a form of social selection. So I think the answer is yes, there is directionality. It's produced by organisms themselves that have the ability to choose. There is the teleology for somebody who's asked about it on the chat line. And there is no doubt in my mind, both that Darwin would never have been a neo-Darwinist. He made it very, very clear what his theories were, and he developed them, a form of evolution of Darwinism itself during his lifetime. And he would certainly, I think, be in the same camp as us in being worried about the fact that not only does life, living organisms that is, direct evolution, but we are now doing so very dangerously. That is a plea at the end of the book. And if you do nothing else, read the last 4 paragraphs of the book. Thank you for that point, Sadia.
But having said that also, we must emphasize the fact that directionality doesn't just simply occur because we humans provide it. It's been there all along. We give little examples of this in the book. For example, if you take Euglena, which is a fascinating little unicellular creature, one of the things that you find in the evolution of such a creature is that at some stage it absorbed a chloroplast. And what that enabled it to do was to obtain energy using sunlight, just as plants do with chlorophyll. And what that did was to fundamentally change the behavior of that organism. Not all of them, you see, would have had the chloroplasm. Going back now, long time. But once you've got one particular kind of functionality, it influences the way in which the functionality of the other parts of the system will change. So what's happened with the euglena is that it's actually developed a very interesting kind of umbrella, if you like, parasol, which is a sort of kind of a red spot, if you like, that filters the sun. And so when the organism is moving along, it turns on itself, it spirals as it moves along. And what this is doing is bringing the chlorophyll in and out of the sun and giving directionality to the movement. So it's one kind of directionality, but it also gives directionality in evolution, because that enhances any other change. Talk about selection, you see. When you get a change that enhances that functionality of being able to find now, for example, being able to find the better position for the sun so that it can utilize the energy of the sun, then you get changes in others. We give other examples, even if you take the renal system, even if you take the kidney in our bodies, you find specialized cells that are concerned with transporting different iron species across the membrane. And they're organized in a particular kind of way to set up a kind of an osmotic gradient, a fascinating little osmotic gradient. It's got these little coiled tubes, if you like, that coil back on each other. And it creates a counter current flow. It's a fascinating bit of functionality. You see it also in temperature regulation. We use it also, incidentally, in generating ways of taking energy from such a coil. And this is used in the system. But what happens is, you see, that the cooperation of all those cells within that organ is itself a selective process, if you like. The better able it is, the better able the cells are to perform their function, the more likely it is that they will persist within that particular structure, that particular way of form of functionality. So there's directionality at different levels. It doesn't mean that there is some kind of a priori directionality that exists apart from the organism.
I think that is why people react, because a lot of times people have some of these traditional notions, and it's kind of like one of those things that I always say, that people tend to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Like they're so fixated, whether it's the conversations about free will, about teleology, that they just literally throw out the whole concept. They don't even want to go there, because right away they have these assumptions. One of the arguments that I've seen made against this whole directionality or teleology is that I've heard biologists say, well, complexity is a very ill-defined concept. So when we say that there is some directionality, what are we to say, right? We can't say complexity is going up because nobody's really come up with a definition of what that even means. But I feel like talking in terms of functionality is interesting. And not just that, I mean, we could only define something if we knew if there was some final goal. But here we're not saying there is some goal towards something is heading, but there is some sort of an interesting, like, I mean, the best I can describe is the universe seems to be getting more interesting with life now able to do, bring about new types of changes in the universe that weren't there before, that even the non-living things cannot do, which life can now achieve.
I think you put your finger on it very well, Sadia, because the problem is literally sorry, it's a metaphor, isn't it? Anyway, but literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because the general reaction to some of the lectures that I've given is to misunderstand them deeply and thinking that I am somehow or other proposing an a priori intentionality. I've absolutely no idea whether that can be true or not. I don't think anybody else can know either. So it's, I think, very important for us to emphasize that this is, as it were, in this sense, a middle way book. It's saying, don't throw intentionality teleology out, because it's necessary for science to understand it. And so I want to briefly deal with your question of complexity. It's not so difficult. Physiologists do it all the time. I did it with heart rhythm about 30 years ago. We found there are several processes that can substitute for each other in generating the rhythm, even when some particular gene or protein is not there. So it's to some extent just a matter of robustness. It is the same kind of robustness that you have in an aircraft control system. If it goes wrong, there is a backup. That's not difficult. It's not very complex in one sense. And yet, of course, the mechanisms that produce all of that are complex. So leave it to physiologists. They know how to deal with that kind of complexity.
Well, you also have to leave it a bit to the psychologists as well, Denis, because
absolutely.
Because we do, because we do, and the sociologists as well. I mean, let's bring them back.
Oh yes, yes, absolutely.
Because one of the things that we're wanting to argue in the book, or arguing in the book, in relation to intentionality, is that it is phenomenologically the case that that organisms behave purposively. It's not always easy for us to know that what that purpose is. We may get it wrong, which is one of the reasons why science finds it very difficult. When you ask the question, how, when, where, and what, they're very easy for science because they can be measurable in some kind of way. But there is a great difficulty that science has with why. And what is done is sort of park why, as if it's all, forgive me for saying this, but the sort of subject of philosophy and not of science. And yet, by doing that, they ignore one of the most fundamental selective pressure evolution and in behavior of organisms, which is the interaction between organisms, which is purposeful, with intentionality ingrained in it as well. We give examples, simple examples, but when we give an example of a chimpanzee using a stone to crack a nut, which is using a tool, we now know that if we see a chimpanzee pick up a stone, we might anticipate. Anticipation is important in behavior. We might anticipate that he's going to crack nuts with it. Now, he may not. We may be wrong. It's a bit like politics and the problems of psephology, really. We may be wrong about his intention. He may really throw it or crack heads with it rather than crack nuts. But one of the things that we've seen with the chimpanzee previously is the fact that he uses this particular stone. He's kept this stone. He's intending to use it because he's kept it, because it's a good stone. And not only is it a good stone, over the period of time, he's honed it, so it's an even better stone. Chimpanzees are not alone in doing this. Incidentally, birds do it as well. Crows will pick up stones and use them to smash eggs in order to get at food. So the use of tools. The use of tools is a fantastic example of intentionality. You only make a tool to do something. And that something, of course, is its purpose, is its intention. It is designed and created with the intention to use it. When you see a chimpanzee or a monkey using a stick and he's carving it away and making sure it's a nice good stick, a nice long stick, and he shoves it into a beehive in order to get honey, or an ant's nest in order to get ants. And so he pulls it back out and there are all the ants and he eats the ants. The very process of creating that stick is an intentional act, can be understood in no other way. When we give another example of Jack and Jill, I love Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill are in love. And, or at least Jack is in love with Jill. He doesn't really quite know whether Jill loves him. He lives in anguish because he's not sure. And he follows Jill around. He finds every excuse possible to be with Jill for most of the day. And Jill is off collect water. And so Jill goes up the hill and Jack goes with her, or him for that matter. Anyway, goes up the hill and they're going up to fetch a pail of water. That is intentional. That's what they're doing. Now, they may do all sorts of other things, and we may be wrong. When we see Jack and Jill going up the hill with a pail of water, they may not actually be going up the hill to collect water. They may be up there to smoogle around and be with each other. It's just incidental, the fact that they're going to collect water when they're up there, or they may have pretended that they were going up the hill to collect water. This is a problem for science, because science finds that extremely difficult to measure. And yet, the fundamental interaction of behavior of organisms, it's absolutely vital. That anticipation of the other and the behavior of the other. Organisms are doing it all the time, in a sense. They're continuously monitoring the environment about them. What other organisms are present? Where are they? When were they there? What were they doing when they were there? What state are they in? Anybody who's walked a dog will know that that's exactly what organisms do. They sense their environment in a whole variety of kinds of ways. And sometimes they do it because it gives them information about the intentionality, the state, if you like, the potential for action of other organisms. That's how the ecosystem can function, in a sense, at the behavioral level, and particularly at the psychosocial, which is one of the reasons why I said not just the physiologist, but the psychologist, Dennis.
Actually, I was going to say that some of the stuff that we're talking about here, the purposiveness, but with some sort of an openness to it and not like some sort of, ultimate goal. I feel like this is one of the reasons why people who tend to think more analytically, as in when they think about science, have issues with morality and aesthetics as well, to the point that they, it's one of those things that, oh, it's subjective, it's whatever, but it's not that much whatever. There is a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of progress that can be made, but I think the tendency is for people to think that there are some, just like there are laws of nature, there should be some laws of morality in some Platonic realm that we need to grasp, towards which, which has been the basis for, religion as well. Like, that, because a lot of times when I talk to people and I tell them that, look, I'm not a moral relativist, but I'm not a moral absolutist. And then they can't wrap their mind around it, because like, well, if you're not a moral absolutist, that means you don't think there are certain principles that are at the foundations. Then how are you not a moral relativist? Then what do you think, that there could be any objectivity? I sometimes feel like even in science, sometimes people lack, and this is one of those things that I think Karl Popper gave me an appreciation for, about, like how deep science goes, that even science, the foundations are built on shaky grounds, and if there isn't any absolute foundation, and you pretty much build a structure, to the best it can hold, and underneath it, like, I forget, there's one of my favorite quotes from things that from Karl Popper about how we build it on a marshland. And if I find it, I'll kind of share it here, that that even science, the way it arises, I mean, there isn't some absolute foundation. We're nonstop going back, cycling back, reevaluating, changing, tinkering with it, and then keep building on it. And yet it's been successful. So, I mean, I'm not saying that morality is just like science, because in science, we have ways to test things. But I think even in morality, there are tests. Like when we create societies, when we want to implement new ideas, we want to test how they work. But again, the question might be, people ask, well, but when you test, surely you got to have some sort of a thing, a metric against which you're testing. But metrics can also change. And I think that's where I wanted to later on actually get into it, but now seems like we are getting into, all these topics are so interlinked. The role that qualia or subjectivity might play, I think, is quite a bit downplayed. I feel like personally, I think that subjectivity, qualia, where, you know, I mean, when we talk about aesthetics, I do think that there is an objective aspect of aesthetics too, but it's not in some sort of a platonic way. There aren't any laws of aesthetics that we are discovering. We're literally making stuff up, but when we're making it up, it's not just, I'm not proposing any relativism, like, oh, my culture made up this, yours this, there is no better or worse. I think there are some that are giving new types of functionalities, new types of ways to cultivate our own inner experiences that are better than others. And that's where I think there could be some objectivity to aesthetics. And the same goes with morality, in terms of, you know, we have these general ideas. We want successful societies. We want, you know, we want to improve human condition. And I think pretty much anybody, most of your people, like people, unless they're severely depressed, want to live longer, healthier, want to, you know, alleviate suffering from their lives and lives of others. So all of these, I think, give us sort of a rough guide, but there's just so much that we're making up. And there are things we've made up that I think our ancestors would never have thought about. Like, for example, whenever I have conversations quite a few times with people back in Pakistan, where I'm originally from, I'm quite often surprised when I talk to them the concept of human rights. I realize that people, a lot of times, they're coming from an absolute morality point of view. They have tough time understanding what human rights really mean. Like, what am I even talking about? It's just this vague concept that, have I just decided because I feel like it, that like gays and lesbians have human rights or women have rights, and then we shouldn't be doing certain things to other people. So anyways, there is this type of fuzziness, and people find it very uncomfortable. So they would much rather go to either total relativism, which a lot of times they keep contradicting themselves, that they claim to be moral relativists, but they're always supporting some argument that they feel strongly about. And on the other side, you know, moral absolutists who don't want to have any discussion whatsoever. The in-between is just so fuzzy that people want something they can hold on and say, oh, now I feel certain, I feel confident in what I have. But what have you got? Like, if you don't give them, you know, that answer right away, they're just going to look into something where they can find some certainty. So,
interesting thing about what you've just raised, Sadia, is this is a Popper group. Now, I remember the philosopher Richard Hare back in the 1950s, 1951, I think, is his book, The Language of Morals. It is a Popperian defense of there being a testable language of morals. Now, we may disagree with what Richard Hare wrote, but it is interesting that people did try, even within analytical Oxford philosophy, as it was at that time, to answer that kind of question with a testable way of seeing how morality could be processed and put to test. Now, what happened, of course, was that was produced at the time when Oxford philosophy was very strongly against that kind of interpretation. Hare would have been regarded as it were, crossing the metaphysics bridge over to metaphysics. And I think it's very unfortunate that he was ignored. But interestingly, since this is a Popper group, Popper did have an influence on philosophy, other than his own, of course, through Dick Hare.
I think the other problem is that our psychosocial, I'm not wanting to suggest that this isn't also the case with other kinds of organisms, and we can perhaps discuss that. And indeed, you know, to some extent in our little book, we do address this a bit. But certainly with humanity, it used to, go back again to when in the 1970s, I was a zoology student, and my tutors used to say to me, we are hunter-gatherers in existing in a concrete jungle. And I used to say to them, well, perhaps we're human beings creating a concrete jungle, and we have choices about whether we do or do not create a concrete jungle. And that what we erect isn't just simply the concrete jungle. What we erect is a complex, and I think Saadia was referring to this, extraordinarily complex psychosocial relationships, psychosocial aspects of our well-being, which become extremely difficult even on a day-to-day basis, because they are, to a large extent, unpredictable. So they create, as well as being beneficial, they create anxiety, they create difficulties for us that often are beyond our control. And that creates a fundamental difficulty in terms of our psychology and in terms of our well-being. I don't find it strange that we find such a high incidence of mental illness in human society, simply because there is this extraordinary complexity, this continuous process of change. It's not sufficient to say that morality or what is right and what is wrong is relative, simply because we're dealing with such fundamentally rapid change in our psychosocial being. We have to find, if we're moving forward with this, we have to find certain constants that enable us to make sort of moral decisions, if you like. I'm one of those who makes a distinction between what we regard as morality and what we regard as ethics. Morality can often influence our imperatives in a variety of different kinds of ways, and we may disagree on those imperatives, of course. But there are some things in ethics that we might agree on in terms of the way of approaching things. Ethics is very much about how we do something as well as why we do it and what we do it for. It's not sufficient to say, I'm doing this because I want to achieve X, because the way of achieving X may be harmful to others. And so we might look at it and say, ethics is about how you do it in a way that reduces the amount of harm to another. Or ethics is also questioning, yes, whether the objective itself is a valid objective given the circumstances. So ethics itself is in a complex process of change. We see this, for example, in decisions about life and death, in health and well-being in modern society. The more we can keep people alive, the more problems it presents to us about the nature of that existence and whether people wish or do not wish to be kept alive and so on. So a new ethical problem arises in modern society in relation to that. When people died at the age of 40, they didn't have the same problems as when you die on average at 80-something or other, or 90-something or other. You're suddenly faced with a completely different set of ethical constructs. And you sometimes find that the utilitarian argument isn't sufficient. So I in my ethics, I tend to borrow from all the different kind of bits of, of ethical construct, you know. I do like the idea that there are certain kinds of imperatives, but those imperatives are not necessarily hard carved in stone. They change also. But there's a relative, here's a bit of a relativity. There's a relatively slow pace of change, perhaps, compared to the ethical process, which can also from day to day. We see this in the behavior we have to each other. Social media, for example, which is a relatively new phenomenon, has completely changed the way we behave to others. It almost gives a red flag, a green light to people to be abusive, to be nasty, to bully. And I see this all the time on social media. It's awful and it's unethical. And yet many of those people who are doing it would regard themselves as being highly ethical people. And you click a button and you've passed off to hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps in some cases millions of people, an abuse of somebody else. It's worse than the bullying you see in the school playground. It's absolutely shocking. And that's created a completely new psychosocial picture for us that we have to exist within. If you go back 20 years, we wouldn't necessarily have understood what on earth it is I've just been talking about. because that psychosocial problem doesn't exist or did not exist at that point. We might have predicted it perhaps, but it's changed the way we...
If I may interject, I disagree. I think you have all of that crap entirely even without the internet.
Yes, you do.
I mean, it's just malicious gossip.
I do agree. You do have that crap in regardless of.
I agree.
But what you also have is a degree of. Yeah, okay, that's a difficult one. You do have a degree, I think, of behavioral constraint in a different kind of way than you have when you can just simply press a button. If you were faced with somebody at a bus stop and talking to them, you have a different kind of constraint on what you would say to them and the language you used.
Yes, but behind someone else's back, there's no constraint at all.
No, that's right. I do agree with you on that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that bullying was invented or nastiness was invented by social media. What I'm talking about is the fact that it's created a different aspect to the psychosocial world that we exist and cope with.
I mean, in this case, now
I
you
think it's the culture, it's the culture, not the technology.
Pardon?
Suggest that it is the culture more than just the technology.
Yes, I think that's probably correct to some extent, but I think that the technology does influence the culture. It influences what it is that people can do. It gives power to people in a sense that they wouldn't normally have had.
Yeah. Yes, this is true. How they structure it. If you have an inept, if you have a limited, clumsy means of text communication, it has the effect of making people stupid.
Yes. That's certainly the case, I think. I think what is happening? We seem to have.
Yes, Sadia is going to make another point from her.
No, exactly. I think we're deviating.
I was thinking, I'm kind of looking at time as well, and as much as
we're deviating a little from the point, but really what I was talking about was the psychosocial world and how this is this complexity. But it isn't. We're not alone in that. We're not. Humans are not alone in having complex psychosocial worlds. If you're a wolf and you cooperate with a pack, it also has its complexities and challenges. The same is true of groups of bonobo. And there are interesting studies in groups of bonobo to show that they do consider certain kinds of behavior in the other as being unsupportable, if you like, and will indeed punish others for not behaving in the right kind of way.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there, but looking at things, and since I'm sure other people would want to jump in later on too, I was thinking about maybe continuing on a little bit to talk of a few things so we can later on pick and choose whatever we want to spend the time on. But let me just quickly share, and I'm not going to share the screen for too long. I wanted to kind of get a little bit into the this whole idea of metaphysics and particularly ontological reductionism. It seems like amongst the scientific community, there's still a lot of people still have very negative. It seems like there are a lot of negative sentiments sometimes about philosophy, and particularly metaphysics. And here's the interesting thing that I sometimes find: I see the same scientists claiming that they are reductionists, and when for example, one of the famous scientists that you might have heard of, famous in the sense that she's more of a public figure, Sabine Hossenfelder. I once had a little bit of a back and forth with her where she basically claimed that ontological reductionism was not metaphysical. I took a little bit of a definition. So, I mean, in my opinion, I think, so basically metaphysics, when people think of metaphysics, most people somehow always associate it with, again, with something to do with religion, God. I remember the first time I went to an atheist group, I mentioned, they asked me, what are you interested in? And one of the things I mentioned was that I really find metaphysics fascinating. And right away they were like, oh, that must be a creationist, must be a believer. And I got attacked viciously. And I'm like, no, I'm interested in, the nature of reality. So metaphysical doctrine, so ontological reduction, I just pulled a bit of like a definition from Britannica.com, where we're basically talking about, what constitutes reality. And Richard Dawkins' gene-centric view seems to be a reductionistic view. It's centered on gene. He calls, organisms as gene machines. So it does seem like it's an ontological reductionism. But what most people don't recognize is they think that when he's making these claims, it has nothing to do with metaphysics. I think this is one of the things that I feel like in public, people need to understand, that you can't really, a lot of times when scientists are making claims, they are metaphysically laden. You can't just put it away, even if you don't like metaphysics. You hold a certain worldview, and if you take it seriously, deep down inside, you're going to find that there is some sort of a metaphysical view that you can relate it to, even if you outright claim to be agnostic. So I kind of wanted to ask you guys, what are your thoughts about metaphysics and what role it plays, and kind of wanted to talk, kind of related a little bit to Richard Dawkins' view as well, which seems to be a reductionistic view. In other words, I guess what I'm asking is, in my opinion, at least, and maybe you won't agree with it, reductionism is a metaphysical viewpoint.
Exactly. You've got it. That's the answer.
And then the question is, what are the alternatives? And usually it's presented as part of science, as if we're being sciencey. There's nothing philosophical about it. It's pretty much just endorsed by science. And there is no other, if you talk about any other metaphysics, can there be other forms of metaphysics? What could it be? And in science, we can test science. But when it comes to metaphysics, how do we, like, if I want to make progress in my metaphysical understanding, what do you guys think? I mean, I have some views on that how physics progresses. And I do think you can make progress in metaphysics, but it's not the way it's done in science. It's a little different. But I think a lot of it really comes down to that people think that it's only science that can ever meaningfully say anything about what exists or doesn't exist. Other than that, there is nothing else. It's kind of scientism, basically. Like that's the only meaningful questions and answers are the scientific ones. Other than that, everything is just gibberish, rubbish, that either religious people do, or in the olden days, people held those views.
This is a lovely one, Sadia, and I'd love just to take it up very briefly. First of all, Richard himself many times has said, I am not a philosopher. He is. He's the world's worst metaphysician because he doesn't understand that he is a metaphysician.
I agree with you. And I don't know, Ray, did you have anything to add to that?
Well,
or?
Just adding to that, one of the reasons why I think that Denis is led to say that, or we are led to say that, is because Richard would often give, did give at the meeting that I talked about in 1976, when he was asked a question, he sort of said, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a scientist. But he then added, I'm only interested in the truth. And this is why I think that Denis is right, that in being able to say, I am only interested in the truth, indicates that the extent to which he is a philosopher, he doesn't really quite understand the way philosophy works, if you see what I mean. For anybody, and somebody in the audience, a very good friend of ours, Carl Zayedu, unfortunately is no longer with us, he then simply asked the question, yes, but what is truth? And you see, science certainly moves forward by measuring things, by observing, but it does so by asking questions about what it should observe and what it should measure. It has an idea about what should be measured, even if sometimes scientists don't realize that that's the case. I mean, as you're a scientist, you kind of inherit measurements. You kind of come in to a laboratory as a student, And your supervisor says to you, you know, well, we're doing X, Y, and Z, and we're interested in the world and how it works and so on, and X and Y and things like that. And but it's very interesting because we don't know X, and you know, it would be very nice if for the next 3 years you measure X. And so the person sets about measuring X. This is what tends to happen in genetics, incidentally. It would be a nice idea if we looked at the association between, you know, this set of gene expressions or genes and this particular illness or this particular trait or whatever. And so the student, you know, does all his stuff, and he goes home at night, and during the course of the evening, all these bits and things in a test tube will be wobbling around and doing all sorts of things, and then being measured, and so on. So measurement often depends on whether you've got the technology to measure it. I mean, that's the other thing. And then, of course, a new technology arrives, and then you say, oh, we can now measure X, and so you measure X, or you measure Y, because now you can measure Y. And an awful lot of science progresses like that. I remember myself as a student, graduate student, being asked, I was giving my first presentation. I'm not saying this, Alan Brown, my supervisor, was a lovely man, gave me wonderful opportunities, but I soon realized that he had a different view of science than I had, because we suddenly realized that we weren't doing what we were doing for the same reason, which was very strange. And I remember this moment when I was about to give a presentation to a society meeting, physiological society. And at the very beginning, I gave the reason why I was doing my measurements. I was giving the reason, my hypothesis, if you like. I'm a great believer in hypotheses, and then trying to find ways of either showing that they have credibility or not. And that was my approach to science. And I stated my hypothesis at the beginning of my rehearsal of my talk, and I gave this, and my supervisor said to me, I think you should leave that out. And I said, but Alan, that's why we're doing it. And he said, are we? I thought you were just measuring the synapses on the dendritic tree, or whatever it was I was measuring, which was indeed synapses on a dendritic tree. And I said, yes, but why are we doing it? I mean, surely to goodness, why we're doing it is as important as the fact that we measure it. If I come up with a figure, 6, totally meaningless to anybody. I shouted out the window, 6, totally meaningless. I could be playing cricket, maybe, and it might be referring to a lovely bit of batting that somebody's produced. It could be the length of, I don't know, a shoot of a branch of a tree or something. I mean, it's meaningless on its own. But an awful lot of science is about what you can measure, and you measure and measure and measure and measure it. Huge amounts of stuff is published on an almost daily basis, measuring this and measuring that. And we don't sufficiently ask, why are we measuring it? Is it the most important thing that we should measure? You know, so I've always believed that important question, why one does something, is as significant. I mean, I suppose the answer can sometimes be simply you want to win the Nobel Prize, rather than just simply the fact you want to answer it. You're puzzled. That I find the whole fascination with how things are and why things happen is the driver for me of anything academic. I want to discover, I want to find. I don't ever believe that I've discovered either, you see. I think, well, I have a very poor understanding of it. I may have a little better understanding than I had yesterday, or better in the sense that it's different. But I never believe that I've got the answer. I don't believe we've got the answer in this book. In fact, we shouldn't have the answer in this book. The very philosophy, if you like, of this book is that we're dealing with something which is open, and we're contributing to something which is open. It's a dialogue, and we're engaging in the dialogue. We would welcome it if Richard, from his different perspective, said to us, I think I understand what you're getting at.
Actually, interestingly, it seems, and help me out with this, I sometimes feel that he kind of, he is a little inconsistent in his views too. Let me share this, and this is what I found. Like, so for example, he promoted this idea of the selfish gene. And then, he admits that he's using it as a metaphor. But later on, and this is this thing in blue is something I took from a PBS interview. I literally copied and pasted. And he says here that I'm very comfortable with the idea that we can override biology with free will. Indeed, I encourage people all the time to do it. Much of the message of my first book, The Selfish Gene, was that we must understand what it means to be a gene machine. But yet he calls us gene machines, but it can override. And then I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here's another statement by him. An individual is a throwaway survival machine for the self-replicating coded information it contains. Either we are the survival machine, which are just like a slave to this encoded information, or we have free will. I mean, I find like there's a bit of a conflict in what he says. And quite often I've seen that in discussions with him, depending on what question you ask, you'll get a slightly different answer. I mean, am I wrong here in saying that I find something a little inconsistent?
No, you're absolutely right, Sadia, to point out this problem with interpreting Richard. There is a quote even in the very first book, The Selfish Gene, in which he says, "Let us now therefore teach our children altruism, for we can frustrate our selfish genes." So that idea that we have the freedom to do so is deep in even the very first book that he wrote. But what he doesn't understand is that makes him a Cartesian dualist, because who is this we that can frustrate their selfish genes? It's as though, well, he is, let's be very specific, he is giving to humans and to humans only the ability to do that. Now, who else did that? It was precisely Descartes. So I don't know. Here, clearly, he doesn't understand the very metaphysics that he is proposing. Now, there are ways of dealing, it seems to me, with the question of free will that does not require a metaphysical dualism of the kind that Richard Dawkins proposes without knowing it in The Selfish Gene. And we try to outline that in parts of the new book. But the problem, I think, is that he doesn't even understand that he has done that. That's the reason why earlier on I said he's a very bad metaphysician. He's proposing metaphysical ideas without actually understanding that that's precisely what he's doing.
And I feel like what happens is that amongst the general public, people take a certain thing and they just run with it. So, for example, some people find the view that, oh, we're just gene machines, as if we're just puppets and it's all to do with genes. There's a gay gene, there's this gene, that gene, so and I'm talking about general public here, not the people who are in research and stuff. And some people even claim that when they read Dawkins' book the first time when it came out, that they found it really depressing. And then he keeps talking about there being some poetry and stuff, but I think there is something there. There is a reason why, because as you were mentioning, it does leave you with a feeling as if there is some sort of a dualism. There is me, and then there are my genes, and then the genes have their own interests, and I could have my own interests, and somehow, and then there, something gets lost in the middle when we kind of divide ourselves into these two, these two parts. And I kind of wanted to, since you mentioned your book, and I'm going to go a little bit later to where you guys talk about, which I would say your metaphysics. So it seems like in your book, you don't shy away from using words like mind and soul, but again, one could just react to that and shut the conversation down thinking, oh, that sounds like somebody who's a creationist. But you also clearly kind of mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not proposing of any type of a soul or anything like in the traditional sense that leaves your body. Again, there is no dualism. There isn't a soul that lives on the body or in the body. But you guys talk about, let me see if I can, and I'll let you kind of talk through this. I'm just going to put a little bit of visual for people to read, but tell us a little bit about what is your way of talking, particularly in what you call biological relativity. I think that's what I was looking for. The causal, let me see. Could you tell us about your biological relativity as I find this?
That gets the issue, Sadia. You see, if you look at all the various levels of organization in biological systems, from molecular level, if you wish, you can go down to particle level, but let's not worry too much about that. And you go through the various levels to the level of molecules like proteins and DNA, through to cells, through to tissues, through to organs. You find something very interesting. Every high level constrains the movements at the lower level, not by forcing them to disobey the laws of physics, but by providing the boundary and initial conditions under which they operate. Now, it is absolutely necessary in such a relativistic view of causation in biology that at a high enough level we are constrained by the social interactions. That's where you get the openness that enables us to be, in the relevant sense, free to choose what we do. That social level is certainly not determined by anything down at the molecular level. It is a social interaction amongst everybody. And you will see in our book that we bring that aspect in, which is why Ray was earlier on emphasizing that I should not have said it's just physiologists who work out complexity. There's also psychologists and sociologists, and let's say so, economists and politicians and so on. And what we're saying in effect is that there is a kind of pyramid of openness. And it's as organisms have developed, first of all, cells, which incidentally have got brains, they've got membranes, just as nerve cells have, and then developed through to multicellular, and then through to very much more complex multicellular organisms, that you have acquired through evolution the openness to have the kind of freedom that we're talking about.
And actually in that, I kind of wanted to bring up that you make a distinction, and I'm not saying that that's a dualism, that's one of the things with our language that we have to talk about certain things. But when it comes to ontology, you're making this distinction between something you call material versus non-material, that, and I'll be honest with you, I have seen other people use the term such as, instead of non-material, the word abstraction, because it sounds more sciencey, has been used. So it isn't something that, I think people who are studying more and more, getting more and more into, coming up with this concept of information as it's developing, people are referring to certain aspects of reality, which are looked as, more like an abstraction. For example, laws of physics, they're not in a material form. And I don't know why people don't have issue when they think about that what is a law of physics? Is this some material sitting somewhere? And I don't think anybody in the scientific community, although there are some philosophers who would say that there is no such thing as law of physics, but they're really more attacking it from giving it some sort of an ontological status of its own. But it is an abstraction, a law of physics. Even things like energy, information, they're not physical or they're not material in the sense, say, an electron is. They're more like abstract concepts. People don't seem to have problem with that kind of stuff, but when somebody talks about that there is free will, or maybe there is something, we could use whatever word we want, a soul, or it's just a word, as long as we understand what it really means. So you guys talk about, and I shared something a little bit there about the existence of, here, like you said, non-material concepts can influence material behavior, though I think I made a mistake. There's something true being associated contextually with material and non-material processes, such as particular neuronal activity. Can you help me a little bit? Because I'll be honest with you, even when I don't deny the reality of energy, information, or that there is something going on that is more abstract, but I'm deeply bothered because by this dichotomy we make between material and non-material. At some point, we have to acknowledge that whatever we're talking about is in some sense part of the material world, or, well, again, in that case, I would be giving material the higher status. Tell me that what's going on here, because it sounds very dualistic, but yet I know that you guys are not promoting any kind of dualism. What's going on? This material.
Absolutely right, Sadia, if I might come in here, because I think you put the point extremely well. First of all, technically, there is an article in 2020 in the journal, The General Philosophy of Science, which it gives our fuller view in a philosophical context of what we think is going on. For the sake of this meeting, I think the best thing to say is that it's more like an alignment. Just as our immune system can align the variations that different cells in its system discover that may give the right antibody to attack this particular virus, so we, through the fact that we have nervous systems and can think, we have the ability to align our actions with what otherwise you would regard as non-material things, that is, values, ethics, and so on. And so, yes, we're trying to avoid a dualism here, but it's not a dualism that excludes the non-material from being relevant to what happens in a living organism.
I guess I wonder if this whole dualism is literally like a side effect of just using language. Like, how else can we speak about things, right? That we have to, when we're trying to understand things, we have to come up with these categories. And I'm not saying like that the universe is all just one. Obviously, there are constraints in the universe. There is a boundary. I am a semi-autonomous agent. I'm, talking to you. It's not like I'm just one with the universe. So there is definitely, there are boundaries, there are things, there are objects. But it feels like whenever we try to talk about them, in our concepts, it's kind of hard to avoid this type of dichotomy. And maybe, I don't even know what other way could there be to avoid that and somehow talk about it. I guess perhaps if we understand that that's what's going on, then we can start making progress. So, for example, one could clearly ditch the idea if somebody says, oh, well, you have your idea of this non-material thing. Well, I have mine. It's called a soul. It can leave your body, and then there's an afterlife. Well, clearly there's a lot more baggage in there. So we could still make progress in what type of abstract concepts are more, what I would say are more successful at explaining the world, right, than others. So it's not like we're saying that we just come up with, you have your own abstract concepts, we have our own. Even when it comes to the non-material, the abstract concepts, we can actually make progress, even though some of these are not measurable as, say, we can measure the mass or the charge in physics, but they're having an effect in the world, and the way we know how they affect the world is something that is open to reason. And I think that's where people sometimes don't realize that reason is something that transcends science. Reason doesn't boil down to science, that it is something that, in science we apply it, but it's not all reasoning doesn't start and end with science. And I think that's where the issue is, that this whole thing of measurability, like if you can measure something, can we measure law of physics? We know that they exist. We're referring to something. And I feel like even there, what it means, what do we mean by a law of physics? There is a lot of interesting debate. Like some people will say, well, these are just patterns in nature. some people tend to almost think of them as having some ontological status, as if they exist in some platonic form and they are directing, you feel like when you talk to people, some people literally have that type of a view that you can't go against. It's almost like a God of science type view. Some people hold that type of a view of law of physics, while some of us see them as patterns in nature, and these patterns can change over time. And life, actually, I feel like really challenges us, which is something I wanted to discuss. That do you think that there might be laws associated with life? Because there's some biologists who are going more and more towards that maybe there are new types of laws associated with biology that are not reducible to laws of physics, but they stand on their own. And this kind of is really talked about when people use the term strong emergence, whereas there's a concept of weak emergence in which they say that, okay, there aren't any new laws of biology. It's all pretty much, it pretty much like physics is all complete in whatever you need to know about biology. Physics gives us a complete view. It's just that when we form our explanations, it's more useful to talk about it in higher level explanations, but really there isn't anything new there. So this is the thing that kind of bothered me. I mean, personally, I feel like there are genuinely new properties in the universe as the universe has evolved. So maybe I am in the strong emergence category. I don't understand how they're there, but I can't deny their existence. Like, I don't know. I mean, I can understand that you're not going to find any conflict with physics, but the questions about biology aren't even a question about physics. So what does it even mean to say that it's compatible, right? When people talk about, I'm sorry, I'm trying to pack too much in there, but these are the sort of things that kind of bother me. That do you think that there are any type of new laws of biology, or maybe the way we talk about laws is just the wrong way of talking about things?
Quickly, before we answer that question, I'm just going to open it up now to Q&A, so everyone can put their hand up if you want to be involved in the conversation as well. And excuse me, sorry, you can continue that answering that question.
Just a quick answer then. It seems to me that physics itself is answering the question. Physics itself discovered that the idea of physics being complete is nonsense, and that's what happened when quantum mechanics was discovered. And the same is true, it seems to me, for the general theory of relativity. So physics doesn't really have a solid base, and we all know that because, of course, they have the great difficulty of bringing together those two things that were discovered in the 20th century, quantum mechanics and relativity. We have no way at the moment of unifying those. So I don't think biologists should feel worried about the fact that there is emergence, or emergence, as we would tend to call it. I think that it's deep in the basic science of physics. It isn't just biology that needs it. There are a number of people with hands up.
Actually, before we get into that, because I have a feeling the questions might revolve around that, can I just throw out one more topic, which might also be something that I know that there are people in here who are going to be interested in that. It's the very hot topic of the day nowadays. It's about artificial intelligence. I really want to hear your thoughts about that. That in this discussion that we're having about this, there being this non-material versus material, artificial intelligence is advancing really fast. And, it's learning from our culture. We're teaching it our culture. We're teaching it our language. So in that sense, we are kind of, are we giving it that cultural context that you guys talk about? And, eventually that it comes to the point where it can be as creative and intelligent as we are. And some people would even claim that maybe more than us because it might be able to do things faster. Or is there something fundamentally different between intelligence that is algorithmic based versus biological based? I mean, I can just put out my 2 cents on that. I feel like people just keep overlooking the subjective aspect of, what we are. I mean, unless we're saying that somehow the algorithms, once they advance to be on a level, somehow magically that thing just turns on. I mean, at some point we develop that too. We really don't, I mean, my point is that we really don't understand what subjectivity is. I mean, are panpsychists correct? I don't know. I mean, like, all we know is that people who look like us, the other human beings and some other animals that we have shared behavior, they seem to exhibit behavior which shows that they have a subjective experiential world, which seems to be pretty private to them. Like we can explain to each other how I feel, like if I'm feeling pain, happiness, joy, but I can't share that information as I can say with if I measure the mass of an object. I could pick up a phone as long as we have a unit that we agreed upon. I could actually tell you, hey, cut a piece of wood, it has this dimension. But I can't communicate to you if I wanted to tell you what red feels like to me. We might say we have an agreement on, oh, okay, I see that thing and we're calling it red. And there are good, maybe we could say good reasons to believe maybe that experience that I am having is the same as you, but I don't know. I mean, how do we even test that? I mean, so that's my thing, that till we get a handle, I mean, unless maybe something magically is going to happen, but till we address the issue of qualia, I don't know what we're dealing with here. Definitely AI is getting really advanced. I mean, we've almost pretty much automated most of the art we know, like paintings and stuff. They can give us all sorts of variation. So what are your thoughts on it? Do you think there is something fundamentally there that the algorithms don't have, that maybe in the future, I'm quite open to having intelligences which may not be just algorithmic bases, but of some substrate that we might start playing around with certain substrates. Maybe there is some substrate dependent property that there is. So I just want to know this before and then after that, yeah, we can open up to the question session, even though I everything.
So Jeremy's actually left because he had his question up and he felt like we were ignoring him. So we'll try to include everyone as much as we can. And if you do have a question and answer, to try and keep it brief and subtle, and then we can get along to everyone because we don't have much time. So Ray and Dennis, did you want to speak to what Sadia had just said?
Chapter 7 of the book. Simple answer.
What was that, sorry?
Chapter 7 of the new book deals with artificial intelligence.
Gabrielle?
So since I've read that question, I'm sorry, could I just ask Dennis to just clarify what he said? I'm so sorry, because this is one of the topics I really wanted to bring in.
I'll just be slightly longer. There is a whole chapter in the book on artificial intelligence, and we do propose a very important way in which silicon-based artificial intelligence cannot possibly reproduce water-based living systems. I think it then gets technical, and I'm inclined to think that given the time, we shouldn't try to go through the technical details of that. But that might give enough for people to understand that we do have an issue here, we do have an answer, and it is that silicon-based AI cannot do what water-based organisms can do. Very simple.
Yeah, Gabrielle?
So what I wanted to know, maybe it's a clarification, maybe I have not understood you correctly, but well, you exemplified purposefulness in evolution or in biology in general by talking of a monkey grabbing a stone to accomplish a certain task. But this is an example of an individual organism acting purposefully. And this is very different from saying that the process of evolution has a purpose or is purposeful. So, for example, I have turned my computer on today with the purpose of participating in this meeting. And I think very few biologists would deny that. But it is a completely different thing to say that humans have evolved with a purpose, or that genes appear or survive or change or increase in number in a population with a purpose. So as far as I know, the modern evolutionary theory would say that the organism carrying them simply reproduces or not, and thus its presence in the population changes. So it sort of simply happens, and we can simulate it in a computer, we can create a virtual organism with some variable parameters and just see which one survives in the end, which of the virtual organisms. So in which sense are you talking about purpose in evolution, about teleology in evolution? Is it only in the individual
yes,
individual sense?
got the question. So who is choosing who to mate with? Automatically, Darwin understood this too, why he introduced sexual selection. It automatically brings purposive behavior into evolution.
But there's something more fundamental than that as well. I don't say more fundamental, but as fundamental as that, because I mean, that is certainly, you know, an active process. You see, one of the problems with neo-Darwinism is that it puts the selection process as a passive thing. It doesn't have an active engagement of organisms in selection. It just happens to be the fact that that functionality is improved or not. Whereas you see, as soon as you make the organism an agent in that selective process, which is what Darwin wanted, once you do that, both socially and in the way they interact as groups, ecologically, in the way in which different organisms interact with each other and so on, so you will give directionality to what it is that has functional advantage, if you like. And you can see that both behaviorally, socially, and so on. Now, the other thing about it is, though, that even as in terms of the biological processes, it is possible for the experience of the organism, the individual organism even, to influence its offspring in a physiological manner. And that what we now know is that process of influencing can be, that influences the way in which genes are used by the system, can also influence transgenerationally. That epigenetic phenomena, if you like, can be, not always the case, but can be transmitted transgenerationally. Again, it's something that Darwin understood as well, curiously. I mean, I say curious because it was such a long time ago. I mean, we now take this sort of epigenetic process almost for granted now, but it had to, you know, it's only in recent years that we've seen how this really is possible to occur. And it's possible by the fact that instead of passing on a completely clean slate, you know, of the DNA, of wiping clean DNA and then passing it on, it passes on certain kinds of changes, certain kinds of switches, if you like, that this system has used in the DNA to the next generation. You see this, there are certain times in development of organisms when this becomes more possible than other times in the, I'm now talking about the individual organism. So, for example, it's possible in the developing fetus that it is influenced substantially by the maternal system in terms of the way in which its genome might be utilized by the organism, for example, in the metabolic processing. Profound changes in metabolism that are in the fetus and then subsequent offspring that are influenced by the maternal environment, by the maternal nutritional environment, for example. Now, it's been shown that that can even cross transgenerationally further down. It can go on for several generations. And if you maintain the selective pressure, if you maintain the stress, if you like, on those subsequent generations, that can then become incorporated, not just simply the fact that it's epigenetically switched, but it can then be incorporated with a genetic change. This is shown, for example, in the way in which organisms have transgenerationally adapted to high altitude and to lowering levels of hypoxia. There's been a fundamental switch. And interestingly enough, in humans, it's happened several times. And you can actually see this in the genome. But also, what can also happen one of the things that the Genome Project has shown us, the most important thing in a sense from our point of view, that the Genome Project showed us is that the system through the process of reproduction and various other processes where it rejiggles, if you like, the genes, it can switch around, reorganize the genome in a way that changes its functionality. And it does that in response to environmental pressure. And you can see this, you can see it in the human genome, where vast chunks have been of the genome have been transferred to different parts. And before we started this discussion, we were talking a little bit about this and talking about the example we use in the book, which is of the children with a Lego set. And you know, if you gave a task to a child, what is the example we use in the book, Dennis?
It's asking Lego using children to build a bridge. And if you give ready-formed chunks of bridge-like structure, the child will get there vastly more quickly. And that's exactly how evolution speeds up. There's a kind of ratchet effect. Once you've got the ability to build things like this already formed, you get there quicker. That's the essence of the argument.
So the crucial thing there, Gabriel, is the fact that what we're saying is that the emphasis of the neo-Darwinian position, the modern synthesis position on gradual mutation is wrong. When we look at the fundamental changes that really occur transgenerationally, they're not just simply gradual mutations. They involve switching genes around, fundamental changes, removing a complete set of genes, for example. We've known this for, the odd thing about it is we've known this for decades and decades and decades. There was a lady, what was her name, Dennis, who won the Nobel Prize for showing that these genes, she called
Barbara McClintock, showed it in 1950, published it in Nature, and she got the Nobel Prize in 1983, and then she was completely ignored because, of course, what she was saying was not acceptable to the neo-Darwinists.
Margarita?
All right. I first want to really encourage anyone who had a question earlier and put up their hand earlier, and I'm thinking specifically about Diana, but also the people who said something in the chat room, to put up their hand, because now we really want people to say whatever they want to say, even if it is giving pushback. And I would like to introduce, there are here a couple of people from system science or socio-cybernetics. I mean, it goes by different names, but they're specifically looking at the whole system as a feedback, feed-forward process, so to say, and putting an emphasis on change. And so I hope that they will put up their hand when they're ready to speak. There is one person here that is Gerard de Zee, but there's also Jerry Chandler is here. I don't know whether he's hearing me, but maybe he'll jump in later. And Ray and Dennis, what I haven't heard you say, and I'll maybe use that as a starting point, is the role of language, because we're all using words to say this is what it is. But I think we need to kind of figure out, so who was the first to come up with the ability to think abstractly? And abstractly is that you don't point your finger to something, it's something that isn't there, and that language is used for that. And so how have you really thought about the emergence of like abstract thinking, that is a way to kind of attack, if you want, or point out the weakness of Richard Dawkins, because he just assumes that is magically the program just produced language by itself. While in reality, we need to work to get an alphabet. No, an alphabet doesn't happen by itself. No, you need to agree on how you use symbols, and then you need to set up a school where you teach people how to use symbols. So if you could comment on the role of language, but I'm also inviting anyone with some experience in system science to kind of chime in, so to say. And then as a footnote, this is an ongoing conversation. Ray is on Facebook, so this is definitely not the end of the discussion, it's the beginning today. Go ahead, sorry, yeah.
Answer quickly to you on that, Margareta. Birds teach each other their dialects.
Sorry, was that the question or I didn't?
That was an answer. Birds teach each other their dialects.
Yes.
In fact, if they lose their dialect, they have to be taught it again.
One of the things that the book does refer to is the question of associative learning, which is a key ingredient of that, and you know that does occur in or can be seen to occur in many different kinds of organism. It's difficult. It would be difficult to say that all organisms have such associative learning, but it seems to me that if you're going to develop a kind of a linguistic process by which you can transmit ideas from one organism to one individual to another, or even from groups to groups, or transgenerationally and so on in a cultural way, that you certainly require a high degree of sophisticated associative learning to have evolved. But it certainly can be seen in many situations where organisms teach their offspring to do various things. I don't know, you know, it's difficult because we're familiar with language as being our linguistic ability. There's an interesting thing that goes on between whales, for example, which is that they sing to each other over vast distances. And there's a funny thing that happens, which is that they play with the song. They'll start with a particular trill or whatever, and then another member of the pod will reply with the same trill, as it were, but modify it. And that modification process goes on iteratively between them. And of course, we can't, as it were, listen into that, because we can't interpret that language. But we can only assume that it is in some way influencing the other member of the pod over huge distances, I have to say. Hundreds of miles that these whales will communicate with each other.
Yes.
And there's a certain point also, curiously, there's a certain point when they just wipe the whole thing clean and start again. So whatever it is that they're doing in this strange process.
Yeah. May I interrupt for a moment? Eric Sherry just joined us via phone, and he's someone who specializes in the philosophy of chemistry, dus as a way of non-reductive thinking or alternative to the reductive and non-reductive materialism. Now, I don't know whether you want to immediately jump in, Eric, but I wanted everyone to know that he's here. Now, Ray, the purpose of my question was to ask about us. So in the 1980s, there was this discussion about the God's eye view, and that comes actually from the pragmatist, that we kind of think we're standing outside society and we're going to tell how it is. Well, in reality, that's the whole essence of system science. We're right in the middle of the process itself. So we need to be able to explain our own behavior while we're explaining everything else. And I think that is this kind of the big question here. What is a good framework to continue this conversation, that we do not take ourselves out of the conversation as if we're as if there's nothing wrong, as if we're above whatever is going on.
Well,
and
yes,
how you deal with that question. Yeah.
No, absolutely. You see, I don't It's extremely difficult, is the answer to that, because how do we as humans free ourselves from the, as it were, subjectivity of our understanding of ourselves? You know, it's bedeviled science and science of biology for a long time. When I went into biology, I found many colleagues that would simply put the intelligence of humans so far above that of any other kind of organism that it enabled humans to do things that it would never allow. If you like, if you didn't have the concept that other forms of life didn't have the same kind of feelings and sensitivity as we do. And now the more we learn about the sensitivities of other species, the more aware we are of the fact that we have to be responsible for what we do to them as scientists, for example. And it's something where my view has changed profoundly by experience. The more I've learned about the life, the more I find it difficult to deal with it, in a sense, because it created a new moral compass about the sensitivities and feelings and so on of other forms of life. That's all I can say to that, because I don't, in our little book, it just isn't enough. And even in our lifetime, there isn't quite enough to answer your question, which is so, I mean, it's so central an issue. There's no doubt that the flexibility, our linguistic flexibility, has enabled us to create an extraordinarily open and flexible cultural heritage, and for us to view the world in a variety of different ways, that if we didn't have such language, we wouldn't be able to do. It's enabled it's enhanced the way in which we can transgenerationally understand the world about us. We can build on the shoulders of past generations. We are doing this all the time with our concepts that we inherit from Darwin and so on. And we're doing it even when we're talking about Richard Dawkins too, and his ideas that we're continually building a new framework. And the language is such a vital faculty of being able to do that. Just as we have a faculty also of being able to use our fingers in ways that many organisms can't do. So we have linguistic ability.
So may I, Sadia, is that okay if I give it to Gerard, since he, Gerard, if you like to answer your, raise your questions, since, yeah.
Thank you. I'm quite impressed in the sense that there are many different ways to start somewhere and develop some ideas and theories. One is, of course, to start with Dawkins and criticize him, but there are other ways, and which you to some extent have mentioned, but not developed. Another possibility is to start with science and identify what it is not able to do. And one of the things that you mentioned is, of course, openness. So it might be that you are actually trying to develop an understanding, as in your terminology, of what it is that makes it attractive, useful to people to be open. And just to summarize, what I'm asking is, what is the type of knowledge that you would wish to identify, acquire about the notion of openness?
Yes, let me just very quickly, Denis needs to leave us in like about 10 minutes or so. So Denis, your microphone is off. So
Yes, sorry, I have to leave now to get to that meeting because it's not here.
Could you maybe quickly answer to Gerard a little bit?
Terribly happy to leave that with Ray. He and I write a lot in the book about openness, and he's an expert on it. Over to you, Ray.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us, Denis.
Okay.
Lovely to have
thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Dennis.
Dennis.
Hi, Dennis. Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert on openness. What I am, however, is somebody who's been influenced by the idea of an openness, of open systems, and particularly of open society. Actually, my background, you see, prior to being a scientist, was very much more in politics and philosophy than it was in science. Oddly enough, I read Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, when I was about 16 years old. And it was a time when I was, forgive me with this, because it does actually relate in a moment to the openness question. It was a time when I was discovering myself politically, if you like. I am quite left-wing in people would regard in my views about society and the way society might organize itself to support the individual and so on, in education and things like that. And I was exploring my political gravity, if you like, my gravitational position, my political compass. And I started going along to various meetings, and one of those, curiously enough, was the meeting of the Communist Party, and well, worth exploring. My father had been a communist back in the 1930s, and I was intrigued to know why, and so on. And what disturbed me so much about it was that it seemed to create a picture of a society that was somehow or other fixed, rigidly fixed. And you had to turn to some guru to tell you exactly how to interpret what it is that one wanted to do in terms of Marxism. And I thought it was something, it was only 16, and you have to bear in mind that I left school at 15. I had no qualifications and slightest idea about philosophy and anything else for that matter. But for some reason, I got hold of a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. And lo and behold, I found in that this whole idea about open society and why it was significant and why, from a political perspective, it was extremely important. And in a sense, I've carried that through. When I became eventually I became a zoology student, and I carried that through. And when in the 1970s, I found myself with tutors who were then beginning to present this gene-centric view, my immediate concern, you see, was that it was closing the system down. And I thought that this can't be how a system functions if it's going to be creative. Where would be the creativity? And in a sense, I suppose that's why we come back to this gene centricity, because it started to close things down. Yes, open system. You can see in the book that we're heavily influenced by the idea of open systems. You cannot have the kind of creativity that we're talking about without the system being open. And that level of openness increases as you come away from the molecular to the higher organization, if you like, the more organized structures, and then eventually the psychosocial level, the more open it becomes. And language becomes an inherent part of that, because what you can do with language is so flexible.
Just
you can
react to
recreate
you.
the world in ways that you couldn't do if you were simply doing it biologically.
Yes.
So,
No,
Gerard,
just
yeah.
react because it's important. You mentioned that this idea of the gene actually closes openness down. Now, there's a good reason for it, because if you don't close things down, you will never be able to use the scientific method and never be able to identify knowledge. So the open question is, if we are taking openness as outside of science, then we must develop something to identify what it is we want to know about openness.
I don't quite agree that science can only give some of the answers. It can't give them all.
No, that's not the case.
That is
science in the sense that we usually identify science, which is always based on physics, cannot answer those questions. There are many other ways of trying to answer it. For example, game theory was developed actually to jump into the hole that was left open. But maybe there are other operations research, etc. So the question I have for you in your book, are you trying to identify a way, a method, a support system to be able to become more open, or even to introduce openness or maintain openness, which is one of the most difficult things, as you know?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
What are we trying to achieve? We're certainly trying to achieve a change in the way science views certain things, such as behavior of animals and the behavior of us. We're certainly wanting us to move away from, well, there are several things really. One is the gene centricity, because we think that that has been a malignant influence, on the way science has developed in biology for 50 to 60, 70 years. I think, therefore, we would like to open that up. What we invite people to do is to consider things in a different way, which is to look at the way the system operates as a system, rather than simply the sum of the parts that make it up. Funding agencies in science have often pretended, if you like, to be interested in systems, but only because they think that we know enough about the reductionism now to be able to put it all together. In other words, you take all the things we know, take all the cells and you record them, and you say, this is how a heart cell works, this is how a nerve cell works, and so on. And somehow or other, from that, systems to them was putting the integrative, was to just simply put together that, and somehow or other there would emerge this idea about how the system works. We're saying is, no, you can't understand it like that. You have to understand that the system is working through a nested constraints at different levels. So you start off with, you don't start off actually. If you considered, for example, the way the cell functions, and take, for example, the heart. Yes, you can take an individual myocyte and you can study it and you can learn an enormous amount about it. But the way the heart works isn't just simply the sum total of all the myocytes. It isn't simply the sum total of it, because curiously, what happens is that the physics of the heart changes if you put it together. The way the pacemaker works, for example, depends on the load that is applied to it. And the load that is applied to it, electrically I'm talking about, and the load that is applied to it depends on how many of the cardiac cells you put into place in the model. There's a curious thing that happened. Denis has gone, but he would be able to tell you this strange thing that happened in his work, which is that when he created the model of his model of the pacemaker, quite a complex model of how the pacemaker worked, he found in the modeling that the more of the cardiac cells that you built, so the more you built the heart, just simply taking what they knew of the mathematics of the way the system functioned, there was a certain point in which the pacemaker of the heart started to operate in the reverse way. It wasn't working from the center outward, but from the outward to the center. Now, this was just simply a feature of their model, but lo and behold, there was another group of cardiac electrophysiologists who were doing something very scientific, which was not just simply modeling, but they were removing bits of the heart. And eventually they found, curiously, that there was a certain point when they'd taken away some of these cells that the pacemaker altered its direction of electric current flow. You see. So now what that tells us is that there's something about the way the system constrains the functioning of the cells that make it up that is as important as what's happening in the individual cells itself. And we see that from cell to cell, we see it from tissue to tissue, we see it from organ to organ in terms of systems, and we see it in organism to organism, that ongoing levels of constraint that occur. And then, of course, you end up with the psychosocial constraint. And I don't know to the extent to which you can apply scientific measurement to that. I'm sure the people have obviously, tried to find out ways. I suppose it depends on what you're trying to do in science. If you're trying to predict a particular set of circumstances, and you may not succeed because those circumstances will be open to change from moment to moment. If, on the other hand, you might be interested in sets of possible circumstance, then you perhaps can do something different.
So may I bring in a new voice, and then we can continue. Natasha Motz, your question, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, it's building on all of this. And the question I was formulating all throughout was thinking about Popper's approach to traditionalism, and that we should be critically evaluating our traditions, the scientific research tradition being the main one he's concerned with. As we move into this complexity that we're talking about, the hierarchy, the systems, I don't know, and I haven't read everything Popper's written, but I don't know how he expects us to apply his falsification and things that he applied to reducible experiments in physics to these complex hierarchical systems. And I'm very interested in complexity. I'm going to the Santa Fe Institute in a couple of weeks, and every time I think about it, I'm like, how are we supposed to falsify anything with this many variables? And I'm just looking for some clarity on what you think about that.
I think that's the difficulty, and certainly, I mean, I'm not a great Popper expert, and I'm sure I'll be severely reprimanded in this. But I think this is the problem that Popper found with sociology and indeed psychology. You see, the problem is that it isn't possible under all circumstances to predict what is going to happen. If you can't predict what is going to happen, you can't have a schema for it. You can't say, if X and Y and Z come together, then the following will happen. And therefore you can test that, because you can see, you can maybe remove X and then see whether Y and Z, alter what they do. You can manipulate the system in a clearly defined way, which is what science does, generally speaking. It starts to hold certain variables constant and then influence one. And then it tries to see what happens when you do that. Incidentally, when you do that in the heart, you find a very, very funny thing happens. But let's put that aside for the moment. It doesn't really quite work how you imagine it does. But you can't do that with society. And because one of the reasons is that as soon as you start studying society, you influence it. You influence it by the very nature of doing it. The more we learn about ourselves, the more it influences the way we behave. And so therefore you can never, and I think, forgive me, please, Popperites, forgive me if I get this all wrong, but it seemed to me that was one of the problems that Popper had with sociology, in a sense, that you couldn't have rigid dogmatic ideas that could be subjected to testable regimes.
Actually, could I just address that question that Natasha had? Yeah, one of the interesting things is I think a lot of times Popper's more famous work, people just get fixated on the falsifiability criteria. Later on, which the book that I really enjoyed, The Unended Quest, which is kind of much later in his life, if not the last one, he kind of said that progress is possible even in metaphysics. And now metaphysics, you can't really test how, because a new metaphysics can inspire new research programs. So by seeing that how new research programs are generating new and interesting questions, and whether we can actually make progress there, can indirectly tell us how successful metaphysics is. So in that sense, reductionism has been pretty successful. I mean, we can't downplay the importance, like the role of it, how successful it's been in physics, for example, or even other places. So yes, so there is kind of like challenge, I guess, if anybody else wants to come up I'm starting to see emergence of new types of metaphysics here and there too, and only time will tell what they yield and in what directions they kind of steer the research programs. That's how we're going to find out how successful they are.
So just to respond to that, do you sort of mean, because I've sensed this from Popper as well, like when he's talking about proximity to truth and verisimilitude, that we can almost reach truth. I wonder if the same thing is true for science, like maybe psychology is almost science, and maybe some of these things about metaphysics is, it's kind of getting closer and closer to science. Do you think he would agree with that there's gradations of science in that way?
I don't know if it's hard for me to predict whether he would agree, but I totally agree. I think the soft sciences, the reason why they are kind of soft is the level of complexity you're dealing with. It's really just hard to pinpoint. Like we try to look up causes and just the reductionism just breaks down, I think, for those sciences. Maybe holistically, when we look at those things, we are understanding something about ourselves.
Marilyn, she has been here, I guess.
Okay.
Marilyn,
I'll mute
can
her.
you
Margareta, okay.
Yeah, got it.
So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but personally, I think that those are really tough. It's I think what we're seeing the failure of is we see the failure of reductionism applied to that, but that doesn't mean that's the only metaphysics there is, right? So we could have multiple metaphysical viewpoints that serve us in understanding certain aspects of reality, I think.
So now I guess Sam is there, but before I give the word to Sam, let's be all very clear, we're languaging, and I had hoped that Gerard or Jerry would talk about that. We're using words, and we just assume that everyone else uses the word exactly like we do. And actually, that's not at all guaranteed. And sometimes we even don't know ourselves what exactly we are referring to. And there is actually an activity that has been used like since the Greeks, and that is that you point your finger to what it is you're talking about, or you point it to a line in the sand and you say, I'm talking about this and not that. So there is a method to stop the hand waving. And I'm just bringing this up because I heard all these big words, and are we really understanding them all in the same way or not? And that's a very important question. And now I'll give it to Sam, and I hope we can understand your question clearly in terms of the words that you're going to use.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. It's been very nice. So my question is about something that was said during the conversation earlier, where either Ray or Denis Noble said that both quantum and relativity theory demonstrated that science is incomplete. I have two questions, relatively brief. What do you mean by this, and to what extent does your work rely on that being so?
So rely on what exactly? Sorry, I didn't quite get the last.
So what do you mean? Again, I'm not sure if it was you or Denis who said this, but what do you mean with quantum theory being incomplete? And to what extent is that something that is central to the work? I think it's not, but I'd be curious if it's otherwise.
I can't answer for Denis specifically, but I think he's referring to the fact that you're never going to be in a situation where you can say you have a complete understanding just simply from that particular level of analysis, and that is becoming increasingly apparent. And whether you need a new paradigm, as it were, to understand something is a different matter. I think in biology, to some extent, we are suggesting that might be so, but we're only really addressing what we think has gone wrong. What we think has gone wrong. I mean, there are other people who would argue differently, but what we think has gone wrong with biology over the last 60 odd, 70 years. For us, that needs. I think it was in response, wasn't it, to somebody asking about the theory of biological relativity. And for us, you see, that just simply means that you can't ever find a particular level of functionality that has, as it were, priority over any other level. I've always worried about it. I mean, Denis is gone, so I can say this now. I've always worried about that, and we wrote in one of the papers we wrote. One of the reviewers pointed this out, and I thought they were absolutely correct, which is that to some extent, we are saying that there is a kind of privilege level, because we're trying to say, you see, that the privilege level is actually the psychosocial level, because our ideas influence the way we behave. And so in a sense, there is privilege level. Yeah, and I think that you see is what we're referring to when we, in our subject area, talk about relativity. And I can't answer for Denis in relation to the idea of quantum mechanics, because it's not really my field.
Right.
But I know that's terrible to say. It sounds like Richard Dawkins say, "Well, I'm not a philosopher." but you know, I mean, for me, I think we are trying to say to people, look, there may well be a certain privilege to certain levels, and that level is the psychosocial level, because it's that which has been so badly neglected.
Right. Great. Thanks for your answer.
So could I jump in, because my question was precisely about that.
Of course, yeah.
Sorry, somebody said something in there.
Oh,
All right.
I just said, yeah, of course you can jump in.
Yeah, so yeah, my question was about that circular causality, as I was trying to reconcile it with the whole purposiveness. And I figured that there has to be some asymmetry in causation for there to be purposiveness, right? The other thing that kind of, and now I'm almost trying to forget what I was going to ask. The question I had was that, do you make a differentiation between determination, as in determinism, and causality? Do you think that causation is something that is more specific to life because of this purposiveness? Because we do see in the universe, with the arrow of time, there seems to be an asymmetry as well. And that is one of the things that got me interested in actually a lot more than I ever was in life and its purposive thing, that the universe itself seems to have this arrow of time. And not just that, that arrow kind of also points in where the direction of where the complexity of the universe has become more interesting, more complex. So do you make any type of differentiation? The word determinism, anytime I've talked to people, I'm left kind of a little confused what people really mean when saying that laws of universe is deterministic. Does that mean like there is some sort of a thing that is determining what's to come? Or does it merely mean that as the things come about in the universe, they're always in some sort of a web, which we can make sense of? Maybe that's all there is. But there also seems to be causation. There also seems to be this asymmetry in which I feel like in physics, we don't really recognize that. I think in physics, even though the word is used, the causality, but if you really look at the equations of physics, they don't care about any kind of causal arrows. We can kind of constrain to what might be the cause of something else in special relativity, but not like one event being the cause of another sometimes isn't really.
Yeah, that's exactly that. That's spot on, actually, I think. And I must confess, I don't know all the answers to these things. I puzzle over this an awful lot. But one of the things that I never really liked was the sort of idea of sequential causality. A causes B causes C causes D, and so on. The more I look at biological systems, the more I see juxtapositional causality. Now you may say, well, what does that mean exactly? States of being, if you like. we see it a lot in neuroscience. You know, part of my life, it sounds, but I've got lots of different parts of my life over my history, which is true, I have. Well, part of that was being a neuroscientist. My PhD was in neuroscience. And I spent...
Commenting.
Sorry?
I apologize. I have.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, as a neuroscientist, one of the things that struck me when I was studying the nervous system was how much it was sort of bubbling with uncertainty. And what I mean by that, I'm using bubbling. I'm sorry, I'm using bubbling in a good way here, in a sense, because I mean, an awful lot of what's happening in the billions and billions of synapses is that there is little quanta packets of chemicals being released at synaptic junctions between cells. And part of that, I did a lot of my early work recording from inside sensory cells. And one of the things I noticed when you go inside one of these cells is you get this continuous waffle, completely stochastic waffle. And this is also true at the synapse. You don't have a completely switched off system, if you see what I mean. You have a continuous bubbling of the system, like a cauldron of activity going on all the time. Bubble, 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 waffle, 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 waffle. And I always asked myself, was this, for the most part, you see, neuroscientists ignore this waffle. You see, it's totally irrelevant. What mattered was the action potential generated and triggered that produced by its pattern a signal that would pass along the long axon up to the higher centers or whatever. A string of action potentials would occur. And we have this idea that, you know, there's a code, you see. And all that the cell was a kind of an analog digital converter. But for me, you see, I thought, well, this waffle must signify something. It must signify something in the process of what's going on and be significant. And indeed it is. It's highly significant. What is happening is that actually the system works by constraining this waffle. Just as a cell works by constraining the ion species that move across its membrane and create and generate voltage gradients. And you see, it's the state of being, which is what I'm getting at, which is the voltage. That voltage influences so many other things that actually happen, to the molecules in the system and so on, and the functionality of the cell. Well, the same is true in my view of this sort of synaptic waffle, if you like. It can mean that at any moment there's an ebbing and flowing of how close to a threshold for generating action potentials, for example, that there is. And there's never a discrete signal actually in the system. You can have it amplified or you can have it suppressed by a whole variety of excitatory and inhibitory networks that interpose on it, that constrain the signal, if you see what I mean. So our system works very much by constraint, not A causes B causes C causes D. And that level of constraint can be raised or increased or diminished and so on. It's happening moment by moment as I'm speaking. It's all there all the time. It's going on all the time. Waffle, waffle, waffle. Going back to artificial intelligence, this is why it's difficult to, I don't mean that artificial intelligence couldn't be highly intelligent and fool us into believing that it had all the attributes that we have. In fact, I think one of the dangers of it is that it can easily fool us into believing that it has all the attributes that we have. But it certainly isn't doing it the way, at the moment, the way in which our central nervous systems work. Because our central nervous systems are a continuous bubble of stochasticity, if you like, that is constrained. And it allows, by virtue of that, an extraordinary creativity.
All right, may I at this point give the word to Harry? And I'm going to come back to your use of the word stochasticity, but let's first, Harry,
Okay, sorry, I wasn't quite ready. I saw other hands up. I thought I'd be coming a little later. I'm not fully prepared. I want to slightly go back half a step. And this is about the concept of causation and the direction of causation. And I hope I haven't got hold of the wrong end of the stick. And I apologize for mentioning Stephen Wolfram, which I'm going to do now. But he is espousing an idea where you can consider models of causation as being like essentially a network of nodes, or a graph, network of nodes, in which certain preconditions have to be met for a particular node to become activated. And this may be, in this sense, it's very much like a sort of simplified version of a neural network.
Yeah.
And of course, because you have feedback, you can, and as we know in biology, but I'm talking about in this model as well, you have all sorts of things that are possible. And you can look at a really, well, I was going to say complex, but a simple complex tree with only a few thousand nodes. And look at some point further down the tree. Sorry, these are mathematical trees, so they're going from the top. And you look further down the tree, and what do you see? You see a point, and you see actually there are several paths by which you could get from your current set of states to this particular state being activated, including lots of feedback. Now, it seems to me that this kind of course, because of it's constructed in that way, you can say, well, actually, you could model almost anything using such a model. So there's a sense in which it's not very easy to falsify it in a particular case, in general, sorry. So it's more like a sort of metaphysical research program than an actual specific model. But I think there are constraints, nevertheless, in such systems, and there are types of behavior which are more plausible according to the amount of feedback and the number of preconditions that have to be satisfied. And I was wondering, are you familiar with these ideas of Wolfram, and do you think they have any merit in what you were discussing?
I think it has a lot of merit, and you kind of by describing it, you kind of said in a much better way what I was really trying to say about the way in which the system has the capacity for harnessing variability. I use that word this time, and that variability is going on all the time. And when you take the network and if you multiply that billions of times, I mean, huge. I mean, it's vaster than the universe almost. It's almost incomprehensible. It's certainly not the case that you get A causing B causing C causing C. And you use the word state, which I liked, that nodal system, as it were, is in a state, and at any moment, and if that state is changing moment by moment as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that change of state is not in itself constrained and modified and molded, because what the system is doing all the time, it seems to me, is to mold. Rather than a decisive signal, it's molding this. See, when I worked on the somatosensory system, and when you touch your skin, it alters the state of all the neurons that are engaged in processing that information. It alters it completely, dramatically so. And then any subsequent stimulus is then processed completely differently to how it would be if it had been the first stimulus, if you see what I mean. We used to do this measuring the amount of inhibition that occurred once you put a stimulus in, and then you looked and you could see hundreds and hundreds of milliseconds of inhibition. It's one of the reasons why, incidentally, that if you hurt yourself and you rub your skin, you get an enormous amount of inhibition, more amount of constraint on the system, and you don't any longer feel the pain. It's the most extraordinarily effective way of dealing with pain.
So Imran.
Sorry, can I just intervene? I should have said in the model I was describing, of course, it's not simply that certain conditions must be met, but this concept of inhibition is critical to any such network anyway.
Yeah.
Which backs up what Ray is saying. Anyway, I'll leave it to someone else now. Thank you, Ray.
Yeah, thank you very much for that contribution. Yeah.
I'm trying to make sure that all the people that either said something in the chat room or raise their hand at some point that they can speak, because whichever point is brought up, like Wolfram, I forget exactly his name, whether he's a useful way of thinking or not, there's an entire other Zoom session about it. But because he puts too much emphasis on mathematical symbols as being truth bearers or something. But let me give the word to Imran, and then there's also Ray, Scott, and there must be other people. I see more hands coming up, but first Imran.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I don't know why, but this discussion somehow made me think about occultism and supernatural. So I just wanted to have your, opinion, your word about, of course, like Popper would not have approved of anything supernatural because, of course, he worked on the theory of science. And my second thing that came into my mind was that earlier when we were talking about language and words, so I feel that you put a lot of emphasis on, words and languages. So again, that connects to occultism. Like, do you think that words and magical spells could really have any power if words are so important? Then can, magical spells can really, I'm sorry, it's a very, very not relevant question.
No, I think that's an interesting question. The answer to you is can words have any? Yes, they can, because if people believe them, they can. I mean, if people believe them, they can have an effect. The question is whether they, from another point of view, another perspective, is whether they're necessary. Now, you might argue that certain belief systems are necessary, that we need a certain degree of belief system. It's certainly an interesting argument. I don't like the way, I mean, I'm sorry to another bit of Dawkins' attack. I don't like, I see no point in attacking somebody else's belief system. I don't believe in God. If somebody says to me, why don't you believe in God? I don't know the answers to those questions, you see what I mean? But I'm just being honest about my own kind of position. But I don't dogmatically reject any other idea at all. I can't. If people have a belief system, it matters to them, and it influences their behavior, and it influences the behavior of others. If we don't have belief systems, how would we behave? I have belief systems. I'm never quite sure what they are, but I have belief systems. I believe that people should be kind to each other. Why do I believe that? I have no idea. Well, I do actually, because I think we're in better well-being if we're kinder to each other than if we're nasty. I'd rather anticipate that somebody is being kind to me than anticipate that they're being horrible. It makes me feel much better, and it's a well-being situation. And most of our belief systems, I think, are to do with the fact that we don't know the answers, and therefore that creates a problem for us all. How do we live our life if we don't know the answers? See, science can live with it like that because it enjoys the fact that we don't have the answers, but people living their ordinary day lives, there's no point in my going up to a person in a bus stop and saying God doesn't exist.
Yes, but we can ask questions, and we can be very good at asking questions, and they're like more and less productive questions, as Jos Vagassi said. Now there's Philip Benesh, and also I would like Brian Gladish. You had a comment at some point, and then maybe Ray, Scott, if you all put your hands up, that I know that you would like to ask a question. Dus that's Ray. There's two Rays here, so I'm confusing them, but I don't see the other Ray right now. But Philip Benesh, if you like to speak, and then there is perhaps Brian Gladish, if you like to put up your hand.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just joining rather late, and only interested in picking up on one tangent, one thread within the conversation. So I apologize if this is very much marginal to what you have said, but I was struck by something I think Sadia had mentioned, I believe, and maybe Natasha had also mentioned something on this regarding how what Ray and Denis are doing connects with Popperian focus on falsification and on the discussions in that traditional area of Popper applied to the philosophy of physics. And I think Popper's work was much broader than that falsification in itself was a way of enabling some aspects of the natural sciences to participate in a conversation that was already very active in the social sciences and the humanities, which was to critically assess knowledge claims and not simply to take knowledge claims that appear to be corroborated to be indeed true. So one is looking for counterindications to the truthfulness that had hitherto been claimed for such observations. I think in Popper's work all along, there is also this thread of emphasizing a need for critical openness rather than being fixed upon an alleged methodology of falsification. That's certainly a very important element, as I say, in order to bring the natural sciences up to speed, as we might say. In terms of the discussion that inevitably is associated with that of the alleged division between humanities and social sciences on the one hand and the hard sciences, I think they're actually described as on another. I think this is overstated, and Popper himself frequently said that we use the same system of conjecture and refutation in reconstructing a medieval poem as we would in constructing a theory of radioactivity. I mean, the exactly the same methods are used regardless of the fields, and we are invariably guessing our way to knowledge claims without ever having a thorough or solid certitude with which to advance those. There is no advantage to further corroboration that would insulate a knowledge claim against further criticism or against further challenge. Regarding determinism and reductionism and causality, which of course is the other clear cluster of comments that I heard associated with the responses, at least to Ray Noble's position, I think that Popper's approach was incredibly fluid and remarkably open. And for those who are familiar only or primarily with Popper's earlier work and his focus on the philosophy of physics, may I strongly suggest that they look, if they have not already, at his volume Objective Knowledge and Evolutionary Approach, and in particular, the remarkable essay, which was originally a 1965 lecture on clouds and clocks, looking at the distinctions and the overlaps and the of what were seen as two very different systems. When we talk about determinism, so often we have a clockwork conception of how determination occurs, and that a mechanism can be identified by science. Indeed, some would say that that is the primary focus of science: identify the mechanism, and you have the key as to how everything works. And in reality, according to Popper, there is at least another area of phenomena that are not clock-like, and indeed many clocks turn out to be, on closer examination, relatively speaking, clouds. They are systems that are formed of parts that are sometimes temporarily associated and operate in a coordinated fashion for a period of time, and there are other examples of systems that are more rigidly associated. He, in the 60s and into the 70s, as he became more familiar with, or as he re-engaged with biology, I think you'll find in Popper's writings some wonderful concepts that were not immediately apparent in his earlier writings on the logic of scientific discovery or in the postscript, on downward causation, on the methods by which, for want of a better term, systems impose regulations, regulatory control over subordinate parts, and how even in those systems, you have a system that is a very broadly an open system. It is open in the sense that not all of the causation is self-contained. It is open to events or causes outside the system that can radically disrupt and transform the system. And then one final observation on the whole discussions, which again I thought was very interesting. I haven't engaged with some of this for some while. Both Natasha and Sadia, I think, raised this. So thank you very much for reminding me of this and thinking of this. But it seems to me, again, there is Popper's work, which he engaged in the one of the postscripts, the third volume of the postscript of the logic of scientific discovery, but also towards the end of his life produced a series of lectures that were published as a thin volume on a world of propensities. The note moving away from the old models of determinism into a situational analysis, which indeed he has very substantially constructed in the forms of social science and in the forms of historical reconstruction, but as a general idea that what you have always is situations in which various agents or actors or ingredients coexist and are in a relationship one to another in that situation that profoundly affects how they will act in that situation. And that while there may be almost genetic-like certain propensities within or capabilities within the units, how those are expressed is very much dependent on the network of relationships in which they find themselves. And just to give one final example from that, he was talking in terms of, if you were looking at health policy for the future, trying to predict health needs in the future, one of the things that you want to do is to work out the longevity of the population, how long they will live. You need some sort of actuarial principles. Well, it all depends not only on the, for want of a better term, the genetic health and the health, the biography of health of the individuals who you are assessing, but indeed the social context, including whether there are pandemics and whether there are likelihoods of war, etc., as to whether longevity will be of one sort or another. That there are so many societal or systemic or relational and situational elements that have to be factored in, that you cannot simply rely on the individual unit or the propensities of just one unit in isolation. So sorry if I've rambled on too much a little bit. I mean, I would say a little bit more about social science versus others, but I think maybe I've exhausted. Sorry, go ahead.
May I? Yeah. So in a nutshell, go and read Objective Knowledge and Evolutionary Approach. Is a really fundamental book. Now, Ray, may I give the word to Brian, whom you know, and then we get a reply to all of you. Brian. So Brian, Gladish actually introduced me to Ray and Denis Noble via the club of Mark Nocturno, the Open Society Zoom club. Ray, Brian, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I don't have a question exactly, because I pretty much agree with Ray and Dennis, at least on biology. But in the discussion, there seems to be this idea that can we make progress in metaphysics? Well, all that Popper was about was metaphysics. I mean, if you agree with the bucket versus the searchlight or whatever, all of these things are metaphysical. And so to dismiss metaphysics in any way is to I think, in fact, dismiss Popper. In addition, later in his life, he was clearly doing things that were axiomatic. All life is problem solving. This is an axiom. This is an a priori statement. of the way the universe is. You know, and he also said all things living are in search of a better world. This is a clear a priori statement. So to dismiss the ideas of a priorism, etc., as metaphysical and not scientific is again to dismiss Popper. And so, and in terms of the social sciences, his discussion of non-determinism about how knowledge in science we can't predict the knowledge that will be produced in science, because each step forward causes different things to happen that we can't predict. And so we have a non-deterministic situation there. And in economics and in markets, we have the same thing, where people are doing stuff and everyone is moving constantly to try and adjust their plans with other people's plans. And so as far as what we can do in prediction of economies or societies, it really isn't going to work out. We can retrospectively explain certain things that have happened, but we can't predict. So the realm of unintended consequences is basically huge. So anyway, that's my only comment. I'm very enthusiastic about Denis and Ray's work, and I think everyone should read their books. And I'm happy that we've brought them into this Popper environment. So thank you.
All right, maybe Sadia, and then Ray. You had another comment, Sadia?
Yeah, one comment and one question. The comment on Brian, what Brian said. As a matter of fact, there's so many like different metaphysical viewpoints at play here. Like, for example, when you talk to a lot of physicists, you see that they're very much speaking from, there are many who are speaking from a very like a structuralism, what's called structuralism or relationalism, where any, where every aspect of the universe must be understood as relating to each other. So there is no room for any type of intrinsic properties. And then there are a few others I had, like recently Sean Carroll has come up with something called poetic naturalism. Then there's another one called temporal naturalism, which takes the flow of time or the passage of time seriously at a very fundamental level. So yeah, anybody who thinks that metaphysics isn't playing out in any way, I think is just ignorant. I mean, they just don't know enough about, they haven't really dived into the foundational stuff. And a lot of times it's the people who claim to be instrumentalists who would usually go down that route, but of overlooking. That's just one comment, but I kind of wanted to get back with Ray on this whole idea of social construct that you brought about in the book. And here's one thing I'm going to quickly read in your book. You first talk about life as creativity, and then you said that what is happening at the top layer is not an ineffectual mirage or illusion. It is a primary cause of choices we make. Selfishness is a social construct along with altruism. They're not created by genes, but by us. What I wanted to bring up was that a lot of times the word social construct, quite often people will use that in a demeaning way. So for example, people will say, oh, race is a social construct, or gender, or even borders are a social construct. And even though they're saying that, I think they seem to use that argument to kind of just invalidate or just literally say what you're saying is nonsense, yet they replace it with some strong sentiments that they have about those, which kind of almost goes against, because they have their own value judgments on those things. I guess the question I had was about the comment you made about beliefs, that you said that, well, different people. I guess I would say that I pretty much feel strongly when I hear about people's beliefs, because I feel like beliefs dictate, or play out a lot in people's actions. Like when I deal back in Pakistan with a lot of people, things that are doing, and I feel like I have a certain amount of activism that I kind of try to convince people of otherwise, is because people's beliefs are actually, leading to certain things that go against human rights. But again, I guess the thing that I'm trying to say is that this whole idea of looking at the social construct, oh, that means it's meaningless, again seems to be something that stems from a reductionistic mindset, because what these people are saying is, if what you're doing is somehow not programmed into your genes or anything, then it cannot be validated. So basically, in a weird way, they almost make what humans do as supernatural, almost not realizing that their reductionism is literally not accommodating the whole social construction that we actually do. And there's a reality to it. Is that whole thing that, somehow the humans stand apart from nature, but we are natural. That is natural to us. Why should that be something that is not on the same par as anything else? Why is it that somebody has to show that there is a gay gene for them to be gay, or why couldn't we have a discussion about what consequences, whether it's okay or not, or what we should do about that, be done in an objective manner at a society level. I guess what I want to highlight is that the whole idea that social construction cannot be dealt with objectively, I think, is a big issue that we are facing right now in our society. While the same people have very strong value judgments who actually ditch the whole thing, yet replace it. And when you ask them, they pretty much put it on emotions. And they're like, well, that's what I feel like, and nothing else. Well, why should I listen to anybody else's emotions then? You have to give me some arguments for which I could, agree to you that why we should or shouldn't do certain things in a society. So anyways, I just wanted to say that because you brought up that idea about beliefs, and then.
Can I say that yes, I agree with an awful lot of that. I think one of the problems that the reductionists have with the social construct or whatever one, and I take your point about the use of the word social construct, is exactly the problem you describe, which is that because it becomes to them rather nebulous and difficult to deal with, and yet when you look at the problems that we face, we humans, it is not at all insignificant. It is fundamental. And now, of course, we our cloud, as it were, exists because we're able to keep ourselves warm and fed and so on. That's absolutely true. But and so in that sense, there may be a privileged kind of construct in terms of the physical world about us that we need to take heed of. There's no point in being a free thinker if you're freezing cold, I can tell you that. Now, but at clouds and clocks, Philip, yes, I'm glad you raised that, because you'll see from the book, I hope that you see from the book, it is heavily influenced by clouds and clocks. And in fact, there was a time when we produced a paper and we actually had the psychosocial thing as a cloud instead of what we've now done, which is to just include it in the upside down triangle, which you showed earlier, Sadia. And people criticized it because it looked nebulous. And we were trying to say, well, it is nebulous, but that doesn't mean it isn't of great significance. It's actually of enormous significance, because it has this malleability, it has this creativity, it has this extraordinary potential for things, propensity. I liked that idea. That what you can perhaps measure is propensities and things like that. I like the cloud. I think that it's the most significant thing that or process that evolution has generated. This psychosocial cloud, and within that cloud, there are going to be a whole lot of different kind of belief systems. There are going to be a whole lot of ideas, and it's far better to have an open dialogue about those than simply dismissing them. We don't want to set up another dogma to replace the gene-centric dogma. When people ask us what, are you putting forward any kind of, we're not putting forward any kind of, this is how things are, this is how things should be. What we're trying to point out is the error of closing the system. And we believe that one of the tragedies of the gene-centric view, and the curious thing about it is, you see, that as we said right at the outset of this discussion, the pillars on which it was built, this gene-centric view, all of them were wrong from their own scientific point of view. They were never tested. There was a barrier, they said. Weizmann came up with the idea there was a barrier. He even says that the reason he came up with it is because it had to exist. It had to exist for the idea to hold that it was impossible for what happened in our generation, in our bodies, to be transferred to the next generation through the germline. Therefore, there had to be a barrier. It wasn't proposed as a hypothesis that he then further tested. He says himself that that's the case, that it just had to be. The same is true of the central dogma itself, that you can only have causation coming from, the gene onwards, and you can't go backwards and affect the gene. Well, this was never tested. And in fact, when it was tested, it was shown to be wrong. Not so much so that we actually now use a particular technique, CRISPR, to actually change, to splice and change the genetic. We're doing this now in so-called modern medicine. This is an interesting thing, but that's what some cells were doing all along. You see, because it can work backwards, but this became a central dogma, a dogma. Now, interestingly enough, they called it a dogma, Watson and Crick. Now, then when he was questioned about what he meant by a dogma, he said, well, it was like creating science by a stroke of a pen. This had to be the case. And in India, and why did it have to be the case? Because the gene was central and causality. As soon as you said it, that anything else it could go the other way, you're now putting the cell in charge. In fact, the cell is in charge. The genome can't do anything at all without the cell instructing it to do so. I think one of the things we say in the book, that you get this erroneous impression that somehow or other what's inside the nucleus of all the cells is the central, government or the local authority in the case of cells, let's say, and that we're always looking for the organizer in everything. It's a kind of we call it a mechanistic dualism, that you have to find an organizer of the thing that's organized, but actually the thing that's organized is the organizer. And that's true through all this, you go through all the layers of organization, you end up with a society. Well, the society is the organizer. But the beauty about society is that it can be open, it can be creative, it can be argumentative, it can put different points of view, and it can find different ways of doing things in life.
Okay, maybe I'll interject a quick question. So the way that I moved along in Popper and understanding him better was actually by taking Thomas Kuhn seriously, very seriously. And he wrote somewhere, if you read a text of someone and you think it's stupid and idiotic and all the bad words, but now you try to think under which conditions is it actually a deep truth. And when you do that, then the whole world changes, then you get a paradigm shift. And so what I found very unfortunate in Popper is the way he kind of had a habit of dismissing the language philosophers as if it was all about nothing. And he never did an effort to kind of say, now, why are they so consistent in talking about it? And then we get to what Imran brought up, the use of words, because we kind of talk about it as word magic and superstition, but actually we do things with words, and that is the way Popper made the difference to me. And I'm curious for you, Ray. There wouldn't be science if there was not the written word. I mean, scientists, they wrote and they wrote papers to each other and they read each other's papers, and they needed paper and they needed a pen. And so this whole process of reading and writing and then having an entire textbooks industry that's stimulating our thinking. So now I have a trick question maybe for you, Ray, and that is the word stochastic. I mean, because what do you mean? But to me, that's the weak spot, if I may say, in your book, because what does this word mean? And could you maybe help us out?
Well, okay, yes, I know. Dennis and I used to have a lot of discussion about the words that we would use, and whatever word we chose, we found some difficulty, partly because the nature of and I'll come back to what we're using it, the context that we're using it in a moment. But what we found was that we find this stochasticity. Let's for the moment just assume that we're talking about an inherent variability which is not directed in any way. It can be constrained. So we find it, for example, if you take a cell and you have a lot of, if you put a salt solution inside the cell, the salt, the ions of that salt will be randomly bouncing around. I mean, they're randomly bumping into each other and so on. And you couldn't necessarily predict if you took any one individual ion where it would be in, let's say, 10 minutes or 10 seconds or 1 second. It's bouncing around. And what happens in the cell is that it harnesses that bouncing around. This is what it actually does. So the actual bouncing around of the molecules is stochastic. It has it's not directed in any kind of way, but the cell constrains it, and it constrains it by producing a semi-permeable membrane, by being a semi-permeable membrane. Now, what can happen then, and this is so vital to almost all the functioning of the body, what happens then is that if you have a salt solution inside the cell and a lower salt solution outside the cell, let's say you had pores within the membrane that enabled certain of those ion species to cross, but not others, then just by random chance, they would do so. They'd move down, as we say in physiology, their concentration gradient. More will be leaving the cell than will be entering the cell at any one moment. Now, what that does is to transfer ionic charge from the inside of the cell to the outside. And it creates a voltage difference between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. That whole process is produced by both the constraint on the one hand of the fact that the molecules are constrained inside the cell, and the control of them by little channels in the membrane. They can sometimes be gated, if you like, and opened and closed. And curiously, many of them are controlled by the very voltage that's created by the stochastic process of the ions simply moving by random chance across those channels. So when you look at what's actually going on physically with the science of any of the cells of our body at any one time, that extraordinary stochastic process, that, as it were, Brownian motion, but in this case, we're talking about ions, is being harnessed by the system to generate electrical potential. And you know, that's really what we're talking about, stochasticity. But you can also see it in various other parts as well, which is why I said that you know, it varies depending on what particular part of the system you're looking at. If you're looking at the genetic stochasticity, you're talking about the random errors that occur in the base pairing. Yeah. Now, they will occur at random, and they have to be repaired by the system. Otherwise, they'd accumulate so rapidly that the system wouldn't be able to function. So they're continuously repaired by the system. There's a whole lot of enzymes that move along repair enzymes. It's a wonderful process. This is why Denis came up with these things like dance to the tune of life and things like that. So it's true that we use stochasticity to talk about those conditions which are simply determined by the inherent variability or chance variability of what is being constrained in the system. And we decided we'd use the word stochasticity.
Oh, okay. Jeremy Schirmer is here back with us, and he had a question that we somehow never
oh, that's a shame. That is a shame.
But he's still here. He's back with us, and maybe we can use that as the last question, because we're getting ready for the next session. And as concluding comments. So everyone, if you don't know Ray Noble, go on Facebook or visit the ourkarlpopper.net page, and you will see his email address there, or other contact information or ways that we can contact you, Ray. But let me now go to Jeremy and the question that he had for Ray.
All I was going to ask earlier on was this. Suppose one went back to the instant after the Big Bang. Suppose one were to tell a story about developments from then onwards. Would you see the potential of everything that transpired later to have in fact been there at that point? Or do you see there as being genuinely the emergence of new things as we go along?
Oh, Jeremy, I knew that the question would be so devastating. I don't know. And I think if you just want my personal view, I think it would be different.
Sorry, different in what that we've got things now which simply weren't there even in a potential form earlier on.
Well, I suppose, I mean, what would be potentially not feasible? I don't know the answer to your question, Jeremy, but I think that if there are multi-universes, for example, then I can perfectly well see how they might have evolved differently. But that's as much as I can say on it, because I really don't know the answer.
No, this is fine. I mean, I guess my reason for asking the question is that it seems to me that in some ways, if you simply address the situation as we have it, then there are proponents of sui generis emergence who give diagrams rather like yours, describing, as it were, different levels and so on. But if one puts the question in a historical form, then it seems to me that, I mean, I'm not expecting you to say, oh yes, you know, in our next book, we reveal the truth about this, but just that the issue then becomes a little more pressing. And I remember when Popper was writing The Self and Its Brain, he was talking a bit about emergence and propensities and so on. And I effectively tried the same question on him, which it seemed to me he ducked. I mean, perfectly respectably, because I mean, it's just an incredibly difficult question. But I was just wondering whether programmatically you would put yourself in the bucket of people who'd say, no, in some sense, everything there in terms of potentialities was there from the word go, or whether you'd be more inclined to say, no, different kinds of things happen as we go along.
I think I'm the latter. But you're absolutely right, though. It's where one decides to put oneself, in a sense. I think that Denis and I like the word emergence rather than emergence. The reason why we like emergence rather than emergence, because emergence implies that it must also have had a pre-emergence to be emergence, if you see what I mean. So we kind of said there are circumstances, I know it's terrible, it's dreadful, that there are circumstances when things just are, and that creates the potentiality for what it is. So the state is the state. It's the state of being, and it just simply was that state. That state became, and as we call it, emergence rather than emergence, as I said, because. But my goodness me, it's such a. We wrote a paper called emergence. Actually, it was a chapter of a book on emergence, but we wouldn't like to be able. We wouldn't be in a position to defend it solidly. To be honest.
No. Of course, I mean it has to be speculative. But your book I've ordered, but it here, at least in Britain, it isn't available yet.
It is now, I think, by Cambridge University Press.
Certainly not on Google.
If you go directly to CUP, they're now saying it's available. But I couldn't find it on Amazon or anywhere else. I couldn't find it available.
Well, on Amazon, you can pre-order it. But my question to you was, are there references to these other papers in the book?
There are lots of references in the book, and not to everything that people would. I mean, we're bound to have left something out.
Of course.
But we tried our best to be generous in what we've given.
Thank you so much.
Do please buy the book. It would be nice to know.
I have. I pre-ordered the book.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. My battery is going to run out now.
Yes, well, that concludes actually the session. So thank you so much for your time, Ray. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion. And, you know, I always learn something from discussing with the Popper groups. You know, and if only I learned just how extraordinary a person Popper was and his thinking, and it certainly has been an enormous influence on me. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
And
thank you very much, Ray. Thanks for your time. And
thank you, Sadia. Good questions. Don't know that we had all the answers, but okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray.
Bye-bye.
So hopefully we'll be seeing Ray and Denis Noble again at the next meet and greet in January next year, and then we can continue on the discussion for that one too. Margarita, was there something you wanted to say? No, you're good. Okay. Okay, so we're going to be going to the next